So, the last episode, we talked about confrontation. And what confrontation is, it's the moment after a situation has happened, after a collapse has happened, the event has taken place. Confrontation then becomes the moment where we begin facing reality of the situation instead of avoiding it. We face it head on. And while that may sound simple, I promise you it's not that simple. Because if you ever gone through a major life transition of some sort, you know it is not that simple because confronting reality isn't just about seeing the truth or seeing the event that took place for what it is, but rather it's about accepting what that truth might require from us, what it has revealed to us, and then where do we go next from there. However, I think there's a process that comes after that, and that's the process of navigating resistance. And so, although we can confront something, I think naturally we hit a point of resistance. So, with that, welcome back to another episode of The Next Baseline. I'm your podcast host, Danny DeJesus. And as always, this is the podcast where we explore one central and key question, and that is what do we build now to reach our next baseline? So, with that, today we're still staying in the phase of confrontation. Okay. Confrontation, if you've been following me for a little bit, confrontation is the second phase of C2R2E. So we're not quite moving yet because I think confrontation deserves another deeper conversation. And not because confrontation or confronting the reality of your situation is overly complicated. I'm actually a very simple person. I like to keep things as simple as possible. But I do want to highlight the reason why we're staying here and getting a little bit deeper, especially around the topic of resistance, is because resisting reality is a very human process. It's a very human thing to do. And so when I look back, one of the questions I think I've asked myself for quite some time is if we know something isn't working, why do we keep holding on? Why do we keep staying in the same thing? Why do we wait? Why do we postpone? Why do we why does a sense of hope come in, which a lot of times feels very false? And here's the thing, I don't think it's because people are masochists and enjoy suffering. I don't think any of us enjoy suffering. But rather, I think a lot of people, to include myself, I look a lot of my past relationships and I see this fear of uncertainty. And uncertainty typically lives on the other side of change. You see, we know change needs to happen, but I think it's natural as human beings that we could be afraid of the unknown. I think a lot of us are afraid of the unknown, what may happen. So think about it for a moment. We know today's problems. We know today's routines. We know today's relationships. We know today's identities. And even if they're not perfect, but we're attached to familiarity. All those things I just mentioned, they're familiar. But here's the thing, the unknown isn't. And so I think as human beings, it's natural for us to be afraid of the unknown. And human beings don't naturally run toward the uncertainty. We actually naturally try to preserve certainty, even when certainty is no longer serving in our best interests. So when I talk about resistance, I'm talking about something much more of a human experience. Resistance is our attempt to preserve the known while avoiding the uncertainty of what comes next. We hope things are going to improve. We hope time may, if there's enough time that passes, things would be different. We are hopeful sometimes that circumstances are going to change. And sometimes we even hope that if we wait long enough, the signal, and remember, if you've been following my work, I talk about collapse as that signal, that we think the signal, otherwise known as collapse, is just going to disappear. But I'm not very sure how many situations I have encountered in life where the initial signal of something that's not working just stops or ceases. Because, and sometimes we think, I think we have this mindset that life is trying to punish us. And that's not always what's happening, because at the end of the day, like a signal, all collapses is information. And when you have information is just there in front of you to get your attention. And so I think and to some degree, I think there's a misunderstanding about C2R2E, collapse, confrontation, realignment, reclamation, elevation. And some hear this and think I'm saying if something isn't working, just make a dramatic change. And I've said this in previous episodes before. We're not here to tell you to go blow up your life or to go make some drastic change. Nothing about C2R2E or the message that I'm giving you is about go quit your job, leave that relationship, go get divorced, move cross country, start over. So this is not a sign to do anything like that or anything drastic, but rather, in fact, what I'm really trying to do is trying to help not so much avoid situations, because if you have abuse in a relationship, obviously there's some changes that are going to have to be done. you know there might be some separation, and if you work in a toxic work environment, again, I don't want to use toxicity loosely because I think we use it very loose, but sometimes some decisions have to be made there. But for change to happen in a positive way, it's going to require discernment. Can't be impulsive, because again, I mentioned this before, collapse just gives us information. Now, confrontation, right? Confrontation is going to help us to understand that information, because at the end of the day, in this journey of life, we're still learning, we're still growing, we're still observing. I would encourage you to ask questions. And I think these are all important distinctions, because if we were to skip the process of understanding and discernment and wisdom, what's going to happen, we're potentially going to recreate the same problem somewhere else. We're never going to progress to the the end of this framework, which is elevation. Now, elevation doesn't mean that we just reached an end state. All it means is we reach a higher level of awareness, of consciousness, of well-being, of new lessons learned. Okay. So the intent here, we want to be able to create different results, whether it's across our employment, or changing our habits to be able to produce better results. We want healthier relationships, better communication. We want to adopt a better mindset. Okay. But in order to do that, I think this is why confrontation matters. So with that, let's get back to resistance real quick. Um, because sometimes we're not exactly protecting our current situation, but rather sometimes we're protecting our story. A story about who we thought we'd become, a story about how life was supposed to unfold and how it was supposed to be, a story about what success was supposed to look like, a story about a future that we imagined and we concocted and we created in the laboratories of our minds. And then when reality begins to challenge that narrative, well, something happens. It's called resistance. And not because reality is wrong, but because the story mattered. The story is hard to let go of. The narrative is hard to let go of. And perhaps I want to take a different perspective, from resistance, because I don't think resistance, again, it's a natural human process. Resistance, I don't think, is asking us to fight harder. And, but perhaps I think we experience resistance because it asks us to be more curious. So instead of asking why I can't move forward, maybe the question is, what are you trying to preserve? What are you afraid of losing? What uncertainty feels so uncomfortable that you would rather stay where you are? And here's the thing, those questions I'm not asking for you to come up with some immediate answers. If anything, I want you to sit with that for a little bit. Because I think those questions, what are you preserving? What are you afraid of losing? What feels so, what uncertainty feels so uncomfortable that you'd rather stay where you are? Because I think those questions can help you create understanding. And I think by answering those questions, you will achieve a level of discernment and wisdom. So with that, let's come back to the methodology. Because here's the thing, we're still in confrontation. Resistance is part of the phase of confrontation. We're not even in alignment yet. Because realignment is where we're going to begin deciding what needs to change. That's when we're going to take the action to start making deliberate change. And that's where, in realignment, we start talking about building, creating, experimenting, establishing new routines and patterns. And that's coming. That moment is coming. But before we can get to realignment, and I think realignment is where we can begin to have hope again. We're not ready for that, in my opinion, until we've done the hard work. Starting with collapse, then confrontation. Because clarity comes before building anything. A moment of clarity is needed before we can construct anything. Discernment comes before making decisions, and understanding comes before taking action. So, but before we finish today's episode, as I'm going to shoot some additional questions your way. And again, I would like for you to sit and reflect on these questions. With respect to resistance, what part of what part of your reality right now you are currently resisting? What uncertainty you are trying to avoid? And do you find resisting whatever it is that you're resisting something healthy? Or are you just afraid of leaving behind what feels known and very familiar to you? And at the end of the day, if you can't answer any of those questions, then at the very least, sit with this one. What story about your life, about you, about everything that makes you, are you protecting? And take your time with that. I never rush for you to ever answer any of these questions because these are designed for you. So take all the time you need. But most importantly, answer that question. I would encourage you to. What story are you protecting today? Because sometimes, wisdom is not going to be found in an answer you're going to generate right away. Wisdom is going to be found in the time you take to really do that work and reflect, to think about what the question represents and have an honest conversation with you. And sometimes these questions will lead to asking even better questions for yourself. And hopefully you'll find a solution for you, a solution that's going to work for you. So with that, if we had to codify it all together, going back to the beginning of C2R2E, if collapse is asking you what isn't working, and confrontation asks what is true, then today's episode is asking, what are you resisting and why? Because once you can understand what the resistance is and why it's happening and what it means to you, we will then be able to get on a path that is preparing us for what's next. And it's not rushing into change, but we're preparing for change with wisdom and discernment. And that's where we're going to go in our next episode. So as we enter the third phase of C2R2E, and that's called the realignment, the beginning of intentionally building a new baseline. This is where that journey, we're heading into base camp. Before we start climbing that mountain, we're heading into the base camp to begin preparing for our ascent, to begin preparing for the journey towards elevation. So with that, I'm Danny DeJesus. This has been another episode of The Next Baseline. The links to the Elevatus ecosystem, you're going to find that in the description. So with that, until next time, keep asking the top question that we keep asking in every single episode. What do we build now to reach our next baseline? So with that, I wish you all the peace, love, joy, and happiness in the world. Until next time, I look forward to connecting with you on another episode. Take care.